la bestialidad imperialista. Bestialidad que no tiene una frontera determinada ni pertenece a un país determinado. Bestias fueron las hordas hitleristas, como bestias son los norteamericanos hoy, como bestias son los paracaidistas belgas, como bestias fueron los imperialistas franceses en Argelia. Porque es la naturaleza del imperialismo la que bestializa a los hombres, la que la convierte en fieras sedientas de sangre que están dispuestas a degollar, a asesinar, a destruir hasta la última imagen de un revolucionario, de un partidario de un régimen que haya caído bajo su bota o que luche por su libertad. Y la estatua que recuerda a Lumumba, hoy destruida pero mañana reconstruida, nos recuerda también en la historia trágica de ese mártir de la revolución del mundo, que no se puede confiar en el imperialismo, pero ni tantito así, nada.
What's good, everybody? Welcome to episode 13, Unmasking Imperialism, Exposing Imperialist Propaganda in Mainstream Media. And today, a socialist analysis of elections in Peru in South America. A very exciting election to see the possibility of Pedro Castillo, an indigenous, socialist, Marxist school teacher, campesino, currently leading the election, who's poised to win. It seems he has it in the bag. Fingers crossed, we're not too sure yet. But we're going to be talking about the elections in Peru. And joining us today is my good friend, good comrade, who has a really excellent channel, Franco, an independent political commentator and analyst of Peruvian origin. Shout out to our sisters and brothers in Peru and in the Peruvian diaspora. And he's the host of Frank Analysis, one of the best YouTube channels out there right now from an independent perspective, a revolutionary perspective, where he analyzes news and politics to explain how it affects us all. Please subscribe to Frank Analysis. Also, check him out on Rockfin and other channels. He got demonetized a few months back. So it's important to support our sisters, our brothers like Franco, who are producing independent media from a Latino, independent, third-party perspective. And I have mad respect for this dude. Franco, how's it going, man? Hold on, let me unmute you.
That was a killer intro that you had in the beginning, and the killer intro that you did for me, man. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here with you.
And no doubt, man. It's great to talk to you. We should have a theme song for every specific person that walks in. Me and my girlfriend joke around about that. Ophelia, I'm like, every time we walk into our apartment, we should have like a theme song that plays, that hypes us up. Like presenting.
Like in wrestling,
yeah, exactly. Like a wrestling intro song. But yeah, no, it's good to have you on, man. I mean, I know a lot of the content you have on your channel, you kind of touch a wide range of topics, everything from stuff in the US, forced to vote, Bernie Sanders exposed. Some of my favorite content on your channel is your stuff exposing the fraud squad, AOC and Ilhan, and the so-called progressives who support the same imperialist politics as the Democrats. And I think also your content on Latin America is really good. And I joined you for a conversation a few weeks back about the elections in Peru. I thought it was a really great conversation as well. Shout out to Fiorella with Convo Couch. She has some really dope content as well. And I just thought it was a really great conversation because it was a conversation with average Peruvians who are commenting on the election, who come from families and understand the roots of the crisis in Peru, because there's a lot of crises that are going on right now, and have a sort of level-headed understanding. Because I think on the left, there are a lot of people who fantasize and LARP about one group or another. And I think your analysis was pretty solid and sober in terms of what average Peruvians think. So before we get into talking about the elections and just giving an overview, what are your thoughts overall on where the elections in Peru stand now?
Oh, well, right now, like while we were discussing before we got started, Pedro Castillo is at 50.2% and Keiko is at 49.8%. And right now, Keiko is wants her lawyers to get involved, and she's trying to steal the election away. She's asking for an investigation to see. She's claiming that there's fraud. Right now, she has like all these oligarchs in Peru in her favor. I mean, the mainstream media there. Like I was talking to my cousin when we streamed this to ask him like what's going on there, like on the ground in Peru. He was telling me that the mainstream media for like the past like 3 months were pretty much campaigning for her.
Right.
It's really similar to how it was here, like when Bernie Sanders was running and they were, the mainstream media was campaigning for Hillary Clinton. They have their chosen people. So it is like an oligarchy, and they brainwash people. And, you know, like how I learned from you, Bernie Sanders is a social imperialist. The U.S. Election system is privately owned. I don't think that we can vote our way out of, you know, what we have in the U.S., but in the global South, it's different. Like we do have candidates that aren't compromised, aren't bought out by these oligarchs, these multinationals. So that's why I think that Castillo, if he won, it's a step in the right direction. But like we saw in Bolivia, like we saw in all these Latin American countries in the past, we have to really be careful that there won't be any coup with the U.S. involved. Like what we saw in 2019 with Evo Morales. Hopefully that doesn't happen. So I'm telling people on my Twitter, I'm telling people on my YouTube channel to keep your eyes out. Make sure that there's no coup that happens in Peru.
Yeah, that's a good point, because that's something we can definitely expect. If history teaches us anything, is that any progressive left leader, as much as they taper their language to try to accommodate the bourgeoisie or the ruling class, they're always going to get kicked out because of the tangible economic material results of helping to lift people out of poverty. And I like the fact that you raised the difference between elections in the United States versus elections in Peru and the global South, because within the left, there's kind of, or more specifically within the ultra left, there's this tendency to sort of write off elections in the global South. And of course, we understand, like, it's not that we're evangelizing for the electoral process or reformism. We understand that elections are very limited, elections are very narrow, and don't really bring real changes all the time. But for a country like Peru, where millions of people are getting political for the first time in many years, which is something that's really interesting and fascinating to watch, and elections are what everyone is talking about, why would you want to separate yourselves from where the masses are, from where the people are? And Pedro Castillo, to me, you know, I was open when I was on your channel. I support his candidacy. Obviously, I have some criticisms, as with anybody, but I think it's important for people on the left, especially in the US, to really understand and respect that, yes, it's not like an armed uprising or a revolution, but the Peruvian people have the right to decide for themselves who they want, even if it's somebody that's not perfect in their eyes. And so just to kind of give an overview before we get into some of the mainstream media coverage of the election, there were 18 candidates who participated in the presidential election. This was the highest number of candidates since 2006. So this is a very polarizing time. The context of this, I was just talking with Franco before we started the stream, that Peru has the most deaths per capita from COVID-19 right now. Like, as we speak, people are dying from COVID in Peru, even though it's over more or less in the US, people are chilling. It's summertime. In Peru, it's hitting very hard right now. So the context is dire. And Peru, a country that has been ruled by capitalism and neoliberalism for the past decades, is fed up with it, and they want change. And it's not surprising that people are looking to Pedro Castillo. And so 18 candidates, highest number of candidates since 2006. Castillo is a member of the left-wing Free Peru Party, Peru Libre. And I was mentioning with Franco in the stream we did for his channel that his slogan is so beautiful and it's so simple: no more poor in a rich country. And it represents exactly what socialism is about: lifting people out of poverty, using the wealth and resources to serve the people and not private corporations. And since Castillo won the most votes in the first round but didn't pass the 50% popular vote threshold needed for automatic victory, usually in a lot of the Latin American countries, they do 2 rounds. He faced off against the second runner-up, who's Keiko Fujimori. She is the daughter of Alberto Fujimori, a right-wing fascist dictator, pro-US, pro-neoliberal, horrible, who did some really atrocious stuff against the left and all sorts of people in Peru, who cracked down not only on the Shining Path movement, but also on several leftist movements, on even people who weren't even leftists, people who were just indigenous and they assumed were leftist because they were indigenous. So that family has some really disgusting stuff, not only just killing people, but corruption, bribery. I mean, we're talking about some of the most corrupt people in Peru. And so that's where she's coming from, Keiko Fujimori. She's not just some random lady. Like, she comes from a very disgusting family. And so the second round of the election took place on Sunday, June 6th, just about a week ago. And as of now, as I mentioned earlier, Castillo holds a slim lead over Fujimori. Unfortunately, she's going out. She's doing her mainstream media runs. She's making it seem like this is the next Venezuela or the next Cuba, that, you know, all these horrible things are happening. And it's just interesting to see. And so what do you think, Franco, like, how do you think, we kind of talked a little bit about mainstream media in Peru kind of hyping her up. What has been your analysis of media coverage in the US of the Peru election?
In the Peru elections, they keep calling Castillo a far left candidate, which I don't see it that way. He's not left enough. The Maoists will especially tell you that.
Yeah, right.
And like I was saying, like, there is such thing as mitigating damage in the global South. Because look at everything that's happened ever since Alberto, like even before Alberto Fujimori, but it really exacerbated under him. Privatized the mainstream media there even more. Right. The income inequality has increased so much. Like, these indigenous people that live in the mountains, that live in the jungle, and even some people in Lima are becoming poorer and poorer. Like some of the similar problems that we see in the US in terms of like college, like increasing debt. That's happening in Peru also. Like the standard of living for people my age in Peru is, like, proportionally compared to their parents, is a lot higher. So that's why I'm proposing. That's why I think that voting for Pedro Castillo is a step in the right direction. Like, we're not going to get a revolution yet, right, like how the Maoists think, and that Peru right now is traumatized because the narrative that in Peru that they're using about Castillo to try to frighten people from voting for him is that there's going to be an uprise of terrorist attacks like what happened in the 80s and the 90s. The logical fallacy with that is, if they get what they wanted, like let's say Castillo is this communist, like how they're portraying him out to be in the US and in Peru, then why would the communists be committing any attacks and hurting innocent people if they got what they wanted, if they got the leader they wanted? It makes absolutely no sense. Wouldn't there be more attacks if they got the leader that they didn't want in Keiko Fujimori, right, and then people became even poorer as the income inequality increased even more, as there's more privatization in the mining industry, with the mainstream media? Like, wouldn't desperation increase for these people as their basic needs aren't met? And so with less education in addition to that, they're gonna commit acts of desperation and might even hurt people, like innocent people, like what happened in the 80s and the 90s.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And I'm glad you mentioned that. And even I've seen some criticisms of Castillo from the left, or from what I would consider the ultra left, the Trotskyist or Maoist left. Like, there's an article, shout out to my boy Josh, by the way, who's watching. Shout out to everybody who's watching and listening. Thanks for joining us for this discussion. One of my boys, Josh, he sent me this article that was kind of interesting from Left Voice. It says, top advisor says Peru's new administration will, quote, respect capitalist relations. Pedro Castillo, on the verge of being declared the winner of Peru's presidential election, has been described as a, quote, Marxist, but one of his top economic advisors says a government would, quote, maintain the market economy and, quote, pay the nation's debts. And I bring this up for a reason. I bring this up because I also see from the left a sort of pessimism of anyone who is not exactly 100% revolutionary. And while Castillo has said, and this is something we talked about on your stream that I thought was really interesting, Castillo has said, for example, this is not Venezuela. He said, I'm not going to be another Chavez. Yeah. He says, we're going to respect the market. We're not going to expropriate property. And when I was first getting into leftism, if I would have heard that, I would have been like, he's a revisionist, he's horrible, like neither
Right.
Fujimori nor. But you have to understand, just like you said, Franco, the trauma that the Peruvian people have overcome, the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, that era of the Cold War and the violence that was caused, and the media obviously painted it to make it seem like what the left did was worse than what the right. But there's a lot of Peruvians that I know. I'm from New York, right? I grew up with a lot of Peruvians as well who will say, like, I don't believe any politicians on any side. I'm more pragmatist. And so you have to understand. So Castillo kind of understands that. He says, look, I can't go into this too ideological. I can't come into this saying like long live People's War, long live this. You have to build a movement that appeals to a broad base of people. And that's not to say that he won't do those things, because I think a lot of times people focus just on words and what people say as opposed to what they do. And this is something, again, we talked about on the last stream, that even when Hugo Chavez was coming into power in 1999, he was saying very similar things. He's like, look, I'm not a socialist. This is a third position, you know, neither the Soviet Union or the US, and I have my own views. Fidel Castro was saying something similar as well in Cuba in 1959. This is a Cuban nationalist revolution, not a socialist revolution. So there's a strong chance that Castillo could move more to the left. And obviously he's just being smart and pragmatic about his talking points. But I raise that article because it's an example of sort of the pessimism I see in the first world left, of like just being so excited to point out whenever somebody's not 100% revolutionary as they are. You know, and I think that kind of plays into that, eventually manifests itself into the ultra leftism that is used against leftist leaders when they're not perfect enough, like how the way certain leftists will attack Assad, or certain leftists will attack Maduro, or will attack Ortega, and the US imperialists will use the ultras to attack the left because they're not perfect enough. You know, so I don't know, what do you think about that?
Yeah, like he can be pushed left. Unlike in the US, like with Biden, like we know who controls him, like he's bought off by these corporations. So at least we can do that. Like we can't also say for sure like how much left he's going to be.
Right.
Because he did say he doesn't want to completely nationalize the copper industry. And there is that article. I forgot which outlet put it out, but he's like, no al chavismo.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't know. But again, are we going to be mitigating damage? Look at what will happen under Keiko. She's going to privatize things even more, right? There's going to be more Fujimorismo. She's going to have more control of the mainstream media outlets than she already has, right? And then so there will be an increase in authoritarianism, more fascism that'll happen under her, and so there will be more suffering that happens. It could make become so bad that it becomes so much more difficult for a leftist movement to uprise. Then there's also the military, right? Then there's going to be even more control over that. At least with Castillo, there is a chance that him and his party can learn from what Chavez and Maduro did and gain control gain control of the military. That's also something that we were discussing in that stream that we did with Fiorella and Skeptical Mantis. He should learn from the mistakes of Evo Morales, of not having control of the military, which we saw the US was more successful in installing a coup in Bolivia, but they fail in Venezuela since Maduro has control of the military.
Right. No, definitely. And I want to play a clip from Castillo's celebration announcement a few days ago. I thought he said some powerful words. I'm going to try to translate some of it. This is from Rupley, and it's cool to see the people celebrating. So I'll try to see if I can translate some of what he's saying.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for your love. Not for just Pedro Castillo, not for just Peru Libre, but for the nation, for this country, for this people, for Peru, the dignified people of Peru. Thank you as well. My recognition to the men and women of this country who have stood on their feet here and in the diaspora, to the people who are outside of the country, who were mobilized for this election. and who were mobilizing for the people's will, for Peru, for democracy, for our country, respect the election. Don't violate the will of the Peruvian people. We will be a government that respects democracy, that respects the Constitution. We will have a financially stable government, an economically stable government. And so there's some more scenes. I really like the fact that he uses a pencil. I thought that was, from a marketing standpoint, like fucking brilliant, because it's like, who doesn't like, the pencil? He's a school teacher. He's talking about education, and just his story is pretty cool. I mean, he's comes from the campo. He's a school teacher. He was a school teacher for decades, and comes from humble working class roots. And education was a big part of it. And I was reading some interviews with him as well, where he talks about the fact that COVID-19 totally decimated the education system in Peru. So now you have this whole generation of kids who are not able to go to school and learn. And that helped to propel him to run for president. So he's an outsider. He's a political outsider in difference to Keiko Fujimori, who's been in the political machine and establishment for so long. So that's really cool to see. So it's not like he's some bureaucrat that has been there for decades. He's just a regular working class Peruvian dude. And it's so refreshing to see as well an indigenous person being represented, because one of the things that's really disgusting about racism in Latin America is just the anti-indigenous sentiment, the racism. So many times indigenous people are marginalized and discriminated against. They're treated as second-class citizens because of their indigeneity. And it's really refreshing to see that. Peru is an indigenous majority country. So you have I think he would be the first indigenous president, right?
I think fully, maybe. But yeah, you're definitely right. There is this like this mentality that a lot of the more privileged people that you see in like the more urbanized areas of Peru, like in Lima, that think that they know more, that they think that the indigenous people that live in the mountains and in the jungle, and even some of the indigenous people that are in the city, they think that they're ignorant.
Right.
But they think that just because they don't understand like what pop culture references, because that's literally the response I get from my family when I ask them. Some of them, like I ask them, like, why do you think that they're so ignorant? And then they say, oh, because they don't understand like what's going on culturally. And when they say that culturally, they're referring to like pop culture.
Right.
Don't you think that they have like their own culture? Don't you think that they are aware of what's happening to them directly, like the inequality that's happening to them, how they're being exploited? They know about that. But you guys in the city, you guys don't know that. You guys are being brainwashed. And that's what makes that's what probably makes them more ignorant, because they're in the matrix. They don't see how this is going to creep up and affect them later on also. Because again, the increase in debt, right? The increase in student debt, the exacerbation of the health system, that's affecting people in the city too. Like how we were discussing, the numbers for COVID are going up, like the deaths.
Right.
That's a result of capitalism, neoliberalism in Peru.
Yeah, so, and it's a good point, man. And it's just like, I think the urban-rural divide. I used to live in Ecuador. My family's from Honduras, but I used to live in Ecuador a few years back, and it's very similar to Peru in terms of the makeup. You have La Costa, which tends to be the criollos, the white bankers, the white wealthy people in Lima, limeños, right? And also some parts you have Afro-Peruvians, Afro-Ecuadorians. Then you have La Sierra, right? You have where Castillo comes from, the Andes, the rugged mountains where a lot of the indigenous communities are based. And then you have the Oriente, where is the oil population. There's a lot of oil there. There's also indigenous peoples there, but it's more lowlands. And I've noticed the arrogance that came from a lot of the whiter Peruvians or Ecuadorians from the coast, who don't know how to farm, who don't know how to provide. They just work some fake job at an office building, crunching numbers and not producing any value. And they would talk down to the campesinos as if they were like animals. Meanwhile, the campesinos who are indigenous, they're the ones who are literally feeding the country. They're the ones who are literally bringing the value of the country's resources, lithium, oil, all this stuff that wouldn't be possible without them. And it's crazy. I think like people, once you're in Latin America, especially a country like Peru, that's when you really see like how deeply embedded racism is and how significant it is for somebody like Castillo to stand up and speak the way he does and not be afraid of the racist right wing in Peru. And it's interesting to note as well, something that we mentioned last time is that Peru has, after Brazil, the largest Japanese diaspora. And largely this Japanese population in Peru has sided with the criollos, has sided with the banking elites, has been more in the bourgeoisie. And so that's something that's kind of specific to Peru that I find really fascinating as well. And the Free Peru Party, like even ideologically, one of the figures that they take a lot of inspiration from is Jose Carlos Mariátegui, who was the founder of the Communist Party of Peru in the 1920s, who blended indigenous ideology, indigenous society and people and culture and customs of Peru with socialism, with Marxism. And I think that it's a winning formula. And I think that Castillo is really tapping into it because he says, look, we have to apply Marxism and socialism to the characteristics of Peru that is indigenous, and also in the 21st century that is overcoming that hump of the Cold War, where there was so much propaganda against the Shining Path and the Tupac Amaru Liberation Front. And so I think he's thinking very scientifically and strategically as to like, how do we create, kind of like what Evo Morales has been doing in Bolivia, like how do we create a 21st century indigenous socialism? And I think that's something that he's doing pretty beautifully.
Yeah, and then to add on to this elitist mentality that a lot of the more white Peruvians have is this is how they've been raised. Like they think that, oh, we know more than these people because, you know, we get better education, and like most of them go to private school. Right. But the people in the mountains and the jungle, they don't have those same opportunities, and that's what Pedro Castillo is trying to do. Like he's trying to improve the education system there, but they're like, no, he's going to take our money away. No al comunismo. They don't even know how to define communism.
Right.
Like all these people that are like, have you seen those videos? All those people that are out protesting against Castillo, saying no al comunismo. Most of them, all of them are mostly white.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a lot of the criollos, and they're you could tell they just look like kind of douchey frat boys, like white dudes, and it's just crazy because they don't represent the broad masses, the broad indigenous working class masses of Peru. And even doing some research, like I find really interesting that Peru is one of the most wealthiest countries. Like I was really taking to heart that slogan that he says, no more poor in a rich country.
Yeah.
And Peru really is fucking rich in terms of like natural resources. What I found really interesting was that during the 1800s, you have the War of the Pacific, I believe in the 1870s, 1880s, where British bankers supported Chile in fighting against Peru and Bolivia, who were united on one front at the same time, because they wanted to expand into northern Chile, which at that point was part of Bolivia and Peru. That region of southern Peru is rich in nitrates, and nitrates are embedded in the soil, especially of alpacas. And nitrates are very valuable for gunpowder, and the gunpowder and the nitrates that they used, the British that they extracted from Peru at that time, they used in India against the Indian people in their war of colonization and imperialism. So I found that really fascinating that the British colonization of India wouldn't have been possible without British bankers extracting nitrates and other resources from southern Peru to use against the people of India. And so there's so much wealth and natural resources, not even just nitrate, gold, silver, copper, zinc, lead, iron, oil. These right now, lithium, these right now are like some of the most valuable resources globally on the stock market everywhere. And if it got to a point where Pedro, and keep in mind as well that during Spanish colonization, Peru was considered, along with Mexico, one of the crown jewels of the Spanish Empire because of all of these natural resources. If Peru is able to move towards socialism, if they're able to start to nationalize or even just bring some of that into the public sphere, so much good could be done in terms of creating free education, free healthcare, free housing, getting rid of COVID-19. And I think there's a lot of potential there, because it's not the same for every country. Some countries are smaller, some countries don't have as many resources, but Peru really does have the grounds to build stable socialism, don't you think?
Yeah, and as far as I know, like you brought up Chile, Chile controls some of the media in Peru also. It's one of those countries that the US uses. Like it experiments, it's neoliberalism on Chile, right? Same thing with Colombia, to try to gain control over that region. Like they call Colombia like the Israel of Latin America, right? But also Chile, like they have a lot of control over what happens in Peru.
Right.
And then like some of my family members and even some people that don't want to study like foreign policy, they're more comfortable with just focusing on domestic policy. What I try to make them understand is, first of all, why I care about what's happening in Peru is, that's my blood. Like that, I'm a descendant of that. Those are my people that get exploited, that are suffering, that it's going to get worse, right? Second of all, it's going to affect me directly, because if all these resources continue to make all these multinationals more powerful, more rich, they're going to have more money, more power to control the politicians in the US, so that they can implement policies and rig elections and then implement policies that benefit them. And then there's more inequality here in the US. And then that increases for us, the pay for college increases for us, the standard of living increases. So it directly affects me. And that's why I say domestic policy is foreign policy. Yeah. Like we have to be aware of what's happening in these other countries, because it's going to directly impact us.
That's such a great point, dude. And that made me think about when Elon Musk during the Bolivia coup was talking about lithium and it's all connected. Whatever happens in our countries in the global South, that directly impacts what happens in the US, and the same tactics are used here. I want to share an article with you. I was reading our favorite city in the US, Miami. I'm just fucking around. But, obviously Miami is where there's a lot of gusanos, a lot of the right-wing counter-revolutionaries from Latin America. And Miami Herald being one of the publications that spouts a lot of this anti-communist propaganda. For those of you who are listening, by the way, shout out to everybody who's watching and listening, to Big Teal, to Falcon General, Comrade Dude, to Oscar, to everybody who's on here. I really appreciate you guys joining this conversation. Miguel Santos Garcia, Orlando, Days of War, to Kayla. Kayla was actually supposed to be on the stream. Unfortunately, she has some stuff she needs to take care of. But it's really important to be talking about Peru right now, because I think it's exciting to see the prospect of a new indigenous socialist leader coming to power in a country that has been historically right-wing for so long. And it's beautiful to see how a lot of people feel inspired and mobilized in Peru for the first time in a very long time. And so going back to this article, I found it really interesting because it kind of represents a lot of this racist white right-wing mentality that you were talking about. It's called Party of Peru's leading presidential candidate is Marxist and wants to nationalize everything. This is an opinion piece by Andres Oppenheimer, who frequently writes about Latin America. So I'll just read part of it. If frontrunner Pedro Castillo wins Peru's June 6 presidential elections, he could be the most radical leftist candidate to win a Latin American election in recent years. The platform he presented to run for the first round election in April looks like it was lifted from the Russian Revolution in 1917. Castillo, 51, was an unknown elementary school teacher and union activist who rose to prominence when he led a 2017 teachers' union strike. His rival in the runoff elections, right-wing candidate Keiko Fujimori, says that he would turn the country, quote, communist if he wins. I doubt he said that, but in recent days, I read the full 77-page political platform, which Castillo's Peru Libre party registered his candidacy for the April 11th first-round vote. Although Castillo replaced it with a shorter and politically lighter version after winning that vote, likely in hopes of capturing moderate voters, the document says a lot about where he's coming from. The document, Peru Libre Ideas and Program, was written by party founder and Secretary General Vladimir Cerrón, a Cuban-trained physician and former state governor who describes himself as a Marxist. He quoted the daily Gestión as saying in 2019 that, quote, "The left has to learn to remain in power, and that's what it has done in Venezuela." Cerón appointed Castillo to run as his party's candidate after being banned from running himself because of a 5-year prison sentence on corruption charges. The party document's first chapter about the party's nature says that it is, quote, "a leftist socialist organization," adding that, quote, "to be leftist, one has to embrace the Marxist theory and Marxism-Leninism." Its second chapter, quote, "toward a new political constitution," says that once the party attains power, it will draft a new constitution, a document that will pave the way for a sovereign country that will no longer be subjugated to the government of the United States and international financial institutions. The third chapter, New State Economic Order, says that multinational firms will have to pay 80% of their profits to the Peruvian government. If they refuse, Peru may go forward with their nationalization. In the fourth chapter, a new public school system aimed at liberation, the party calls for a new school system that will form citizens who will be, quote, "autonomous and revolutionary." In the sixth chapter about transportation and media policies, the document says that Peru's high concentration of news media in the hands of a few private companies, quote, "must not only be fought against, but prohibited." A subchapter, Lenin and Fidel, concludes that Russian Revolution leader Vladimir Lenin was right in saying that the true freedom of the press in a society will only be possible once it liberates itself from the yoke of capital. It later quotes a similar statement by late Cuban, he calls him dictator, Fidel Castro. Castillo's latest political platform, which he presented in May, looks kinder, gentler, but it's not too different. It vows to convene a referendum to draft a new constitution, which would replace the current one that it claims, quote, "prioritizes private interest over the public interest and profits over life and dignity." Castillo's plan is a copy and paste version of the Chavista manual, which has been used in Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador. You win elections, use your political honeymoon to replace the constitution, then enact a new one that allows you to stay in power indefinitely. It sounds crazy that Peru, which has been pretty successful in reducing poverty during the past 2 decades, would choose to go that route. But it's part of the political aftershocks of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has ruined the economy. There are record levels of unemployment, which are driving many Peruvians to seek radical, or rather magical, solutions. Fujimori, too, has authoritarian genes. She's the daughter of Alberto Fujimori, the right-wing president who illegally shut down Congress in 1992. And she's also facing corruption charges. But there's a big difference between Fujimori and Castillo. While Fujimori promises to respect the rule of law and surrounded herself with former critics with strong democratic credentials, Castillo vows to change the constitution to create a de facto authoritarian state. And he kept Cerón as his party's leader. With Castillo, Peru may choose a road with no return. And here's this fucking zombie, Andrés Oppenheimer. He looks like he just crawled out of a fucking coffin. Who knows? But this is his op-ed again. This is from Miami Herald. This is the typical right-wing anti-communist perspective about what Peru and the election. Before I pass it over to you, Franco, I mean, the one takeaway that I got from that article, a lot of the stuff that they are proposing sounds pretty dope and pretty amazing and inspiring. And
that's what I was thinking.
Right. I was like, oh, that sounds really cool. And a lot of the ultras will kind of be, probably weren't aware of some of that stuff. Secondly, I think it's interesting that he totally whitewashed Keiko Fujimori. He's like, she has some corruption stuff. Her dad was a little bit authoritarian, but she has strong democratic credentials. But this guy who's never been in office, who's a humble school teacher, he's the problem. And it's just complete bullshit. But your reaction to that article?
Yeah, so some guy with no money, no power, who was a unionist,
right.
for teachers, is a bigger threat than Keiko Fujimori, who had control of the media, who's a daughter of a dictator, who, under his rule, he changed the constitution, right? A lot of those things that he was saying that are in the constitution right now are products of what Alberto Fujimori did when he changed it. So under him, Peru became more authoritarian. Right? There's a few people that now have control over that country, these capitalists, and that were all favoring Keiko Fujimori. So if Castillo wants to change it to favor the people more, because the country should be favoring the people, not just like a few, private industries, like how it says in the Constitution right there. And he was democratically elected. Fiorella, who's investigating the elections there in Peru right now, and other people who are there aren't finding any evidence of fraud. Then this is the will of the people here. Castillo is just implementing what the people want. So I see no problem in what he wants to do. I don't see how that's authoritarian. On the other hand, Keiko, who had like the power of the media favoring her, I see that as more authoritarian. Like the few capitalists have power over her and have power in brainwashing the people. That's more authoritarian in my eyes.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just like, it's a complete blindsidedness to what has happened in reality, and just creating, like, they create this straw man of Pedro Castillo. He's not even in office yet, and they're saying all these things that he's going to do. Yeah. He's this and that. I'm like, dude, he's just he's just like a humble school teacher. He's never been in office. And then with Keiko, they just kind of totally whitewash her crimes. And her family has just been done some really disgusting stuff. And moving a little bit, I wanted to ask you, Franco, because I know, obviously your family's from Peru. I think you were born in Peru, right? If I'm not mistaken, or
I was born here.
Okay,
I was born here, but just to add on to a little bit what you were saying, what Alberto Fujimori has done, just so people know, there's government documents that show that he planned to sterilize people, like the indigenous people in the mountains and the jungle, and that was done. Like people were sterilized. You can find interviews of indigenous people whose family members were sterilized. It's absolutely disgusting. And also that video that you did with Kayla Pop, you guys also talked about a bit of the crimes against humanity that Fujimori has done. But yeah, I was born in the U.S. My parents were, they lived in Lima. My mom lived in La Victoria, which is a more, like, I would say, like, I would compare it, I don't know, to like the Bronx, I guess, of Peru.
Okay.
And then my dad was from Chosica, which is like, I can't remember if it's like more north or south in Lima, but like compared to the rest of the country, like all the indigenous people, my parents were more privileged, right? Yeah. So they had more opportunities to study, and not to say that it wasn't like a cakewalk. Like, yeah, they studied a lot to get to where they were, and get a PhD and study in the U.S. And after they came to the U.S., they stayed there. They thought that, me and my sisters would have a better life if we were raised here in the States. But with all the experiences that I went through, like seeing the way that Black people live, seeing the way that some of the Central Americans and other Latin Americans live here, and the reasons for why they came to this country, my friends, some of which that my dad coached, like for soccer, which opened his eyes a lot.
Interesting.
That if it wasn't for that, like that experience, I wouldn't be where I am today. Otherwise I'd be like how some of my cousins are, with the exception of like a few of them, who see, the injustice that a lot of the indigenous people face. And most of my family reflect how a lot of the people in these urbanized areas think. They think, if you just work hard, you can get you can get out of the slums.
Right.
Well, like in Lima, like in these cities, you have more opportunity to do that. But in the mountains and in the jungle, and even some people who are more poor in the cities, like they don't have those same opportunities. They didn't get private school education. It's even harder now that there's more inequality, now that schools are funded even less, right? Those opportunities were not presented to them. So the reason why you got to where you were isn't just because you worked hard. Yeah, some of you did work hard, but there were opportunities that were presented to you because of where you were born and what family you were born into.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I find it really interesting how you brought it full circle and made it internationalized, because where you're at right now, I think you're in the DC DMV area, if I'm not mistaken. And you were mentioning that, there's a big Central American community there. And during the 80s and up into like in the 90s and stuff, the Fujimori era, that same time period, the US was financing genocide in Central America as well, in El Salvador. with the right-wing military dictatorship of Roberto Daubison that was murdering indigenous peoples there as well, also sterilizing indigenous peoples there as well. In Guatemala with Efraín Ríos Montt, who was also murdering indigenous Maya, sterilizing indigenous Maya with right-wing death squads. And it's crazy because like where you're at right now, you can be, like you're saying how your dad was a coach, and with your community there with Peruvians or Central Americans, you can see how is it that Peruvians and Central Americans ended up in this one random swamp in the middle of the US, in DC, and it's because of US imperialism. It's because this country financed right-wing, far-right, evangelical, Christian, whatever, dictatorships that murdered, sterilized, and oppressed indigenous peoples in our countries. And so now our peoples have been forced to leave our countries and migrate to this empire to work as slaves for these huge corporations and to vote for these two imperialist parties that do nothing for our people. And it's just interesting to connect that full circle, because we have to view things not in a vacuum. Like Fujimori was in the 80s, dude, like that was a rough time to be a leftist, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. A lot of like people were called traitors to the country, communist. It was just a faction of communists and people who were killing innocent people, and then the whole communist movement got painted as terrorists over there. And a lot of people from Peru are still traumatized by that. That's the narrative that they use to try to scare people away from voting for Castillo, and it's taken 3 decades for a Castillo to rise. It's like somebody like him. And I just want to also say something that me and my friends talk about, something to make them, I try to make them think, because a lot of my friends are descendants of immigrants, right? Is that even though their parents immigrated here, from their Central American or South American countries, they were able to afford a house, working just like one job. Or just both parents have a job, right? Now, us now, we have the same. We're the same age that our parents were when they were able to afford that and start a family.
Right.
It's a lot. It's proportionally, it's more difficult. Like we're living with roommates. Some of them are still living with their parents. Why do you think that is? It's because of capitalism. It happens so incrementally, right? To the point where people don't really notice it until people like us point it out to them and try and point things out in history of why these things are happening. Why is it why is college more expensive? Why is the standard of living going up? And at the same time, these capitalists, these multinationals are enriching themselves from all the resources, all these precious resources from these Latin American countries. And not only just that, but all across the global South. And it's going to exacerbate even more with what's happening with Klaus Schwab and the Fourth Industrial Revolution. There's a PDF describing what they plan to do: deep sea mining in the South, in Africa, more cobalt, so they can. And then they use environmentalism as a talking point, to have more green energy, even though that's only going to benefit the capitalists, the big green capitalists, not the people. Right? They're still destroying the environment. The global South is still being exploited. So I'm glad that there's people like us that are informing people about the horrors of this and how this directly affects us.
It does. It's scary times, and you see rising hopelessness and a lack of enthusiasm for the future, which is really sad to see amongst a lot of the younger generations, because we live in the era of capitalist crisis. And capitalism, I think we're at a unique point where we're able to see how capitalism is failing. A lot of people, I find it interesting because a lot of people I talk to who are in their 40s and their 50s, I think that's the generation before us. I think they're Gen X, right? And they're kind of they were around it for an interesting time period because they grew up around the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union, or the overthrow of the Soviet Union, rather, and the US claiming victory. And a lot of people that I talk to who are boomers or Gen X, they're like, no, I saw the Soviet Union fall, capitalism won, that's it. But our generation that was born after that, we're able to see the quote unquote victory of capitalism, which was complete bullshit. the financial crisis, all these endless wars, we're in a unique position to see how it's collapsing. And I think that's why I'm optimistic that the next generation of youth, not only in the US, but in Latin America and the world as a whole, are becoming more anti-capitalist. And I don't know, what do you think? Do you feel like in Peru and the US as well, like, do you feel like people are becoming more anti-capitalist and more socialist?
And it's thanks to the internet. That's something that, you know, our parents didn't have, and why a lot of them are more traditional, but the internet really accelerated the exchange of information. And that's why these capitalists in big tech, the intelligence community, are trying to censor a lot of channels like this.
Yeah,
like my channel is demonetized. I know that when you were at Anti-Conquista, you guys never monetized your channel, but I'm pretty sure you guys would have been targeted. So they're trying, like they're really afraid of us. Like, more of us are becoming aware. These online communities that you find on YouTube, on Discord, on Rockman, on Twitter, these online communities are starting to form events. Like, it's forming into on the ground communities. And that's something that I try to promote as a solution, is let's form more online communities so that we can exchange more information, you know, teach people about how you can opt out of the system, learn from some of the programs that the Black Panthers did. You know, because we can't keep giving money to these capitalists. We can't. We're empowering them even more, and inform as many people as you can about how this extends globally. You know, how they're trying to how they're trying to gain control over the global South. And something that I will tell Mouse is that with Castillo, right, at least the Western powers will have less control over the region if we have somebody like him in power. As opposed to if Keiko was there, or if another neoliberal was there, the Western powers will have more control over South and Central America.
Exactly. Yeah, you have to understand also as well that, like, what is most beneficial to the people in the immediate, because the people of Peru, like, here's the fascinating thing, right? A lot of the ultras in the US who will refuse to support Castillo, they'll say nobody's good enough for me, fuck everything. But then it's like, okay, now once the election is over, it's the Peruvian people who are going to have to deal with Fujimori and neoliberalism and crackdowns. And you've already moved on to some other thing that you're seeing online, you know, and it's kind of like on the day-to-day, the Peruvian people are the ones who are going to have to deal with this every single day of their lives. Why wouldn't you want to have them to have a little bit better? And again, people will flip that and will say, oh, that's reformist, that's revisionist. But it's like, it's different in the US versus Peru, because US is an imperialist country. The US, and
it doesn't matter who you vote, because like both main parties are controlled by the same people, and they control the elections. So either way, they're good, they win. But it's not the case in the global South, like how we were just describing, where there can be that one candidate that's not controlled.
Exactly. And the analogy I compare it to is turbulence on a flight. If you're on an airplane and there's turbulence, you want somebody to take control of the plane and smooth it out, regardless of who the pilot is. And that's how capitalist crises are. That's how it is in Peru right now, where literally millions of people are dying because of COVID. The economy is in complete shambles. There's crises going on in Peru right now. People want peace. They want stability. That's what they want. They don't want more chaos and crisis. And if you present yourself as somebody, as a communist, if I was a communist running in Peru, imagine if I was like, we're going to ramp up the chaos. We're going to, do all this crazy. And it's like, dude, like, people who experience violence and chaos and crisis on their day-to-day, they want stability. They want that plane to stop moving. They want peace. And I think that we can, as people on the left in the US, like, we can't forget that they're the ones who have to deal with the repercussions of this on the day-to-day. And so that's why, again, I have some disagreements with Castillo himself. Like, I don't agree with necessarily everything, but I think for right now, for Peru, he's kind of like the best option. But kind of pivoting a little bit, I wanted to ask you, Franco, if right now, hypothetically, Castillo wins and he hits you up and he's like, yo, Franco, I want you on my advisory board. You're going to be on my executive board to help advise me to run the new Peru. What are 5 policy proposals that you would give him?
Ooh. I would tell him, to nationalize the. That's something that I really need to think about. But mainly in the mining industry, right? Because that's what a lot of the most powerful capitalists want to take control over. I would say keep your eyes out on that.
Yeah.
Try to nationalize that as much as you can, and then you can use that to, fund education and improve the healthcare system in Peru, give people free healthcare. The other thing I would tell them is gain control from the military. Learn from the mistake of Evo Morales and learn from how the success of Maduro and Chavez.
Yeah.
So that's two right there. The third would be, I don't know, would you say it's smart to help fund like the campaigns of other socialist campaigns like in Colombia and Chile? Or do you think that Peru won't have enough? Like that most of that money needs to be going towards the people?
Yeah, I feel like, in my opinion, internationalism is something that you should practice, but I think financially it's something that comes a little bit after, once you've fortified yourself as a power. Like Cuba, for example, in the 1970s, we know helped with the liberation of Angola, Mozambique, South Africa against colonialism and apartheid. And that was after 10, 12 years of building socialism in Cuba. And I think in my opinion, at least, I think the Peruvian people would be a little weary of immediately supporting, something internationally. But of course, internationalism is a key part of it. Yeah. I think one thing that's really important as well is establishing a plurinational republic, kind of like the way Bolivia established. It's the plurinational Republic of Bolivia. What does that mean? That means that there are many nations within that one nation, and reflects the ethnic composition of Peru, where you have Afro-Peruvians on the coast who are historically marginalized, almost never talked about, and who have their lands confiscated. You have indigenous Peruvians who are not in control of their lands, and many types of indigenous people. I think Peru has one of the largest amount of different kinds of indigenous peoples in its border. So establishing Peru as a plurinational republic, where each nation within that nation acts like a federation together and can help make rules based on autonomy, I think that would be pretty cool,
Yeah, that would be cool. Some of the other things that I would push for would be having remove don't keep the mainstream media privatized. Have it be a public service. I don't know. I'd have to look at like what the benefits are of having like national media, like in Peru. But I know the big criticisms that people give like national media, like, oh, it's biased media, even though that it's trying to counter the U.S. branded media that like, for example, the private media. The private mainstream media in Peru and all these other South American countries are going to give talking points that benefit the U.S. So we can call it like U.S. media. But traditionally, media is supposed to be like a public service, like working class people do that. So that could help strengthen like more accurate information in Peru.
And have actually indigenous presenters. Like one thing that was really refreshing in Bolivia with public television, Bolivia TV, is that they had indigenous women, the quote unquote cholitas, presenting. And that's something I noticed with Peruvian media, is like, even though it's a majority indigenous country, it's almost always like white people presenting,
Yeah. And then like the last thing I would do, like this is not like set in stone for me. Like all these five, like this is something that I'd really have to think about and talk about with like my counsel. Like for my channel, I have people who like advise me and like give me information. Like I don't want to be, I don't want to be like, I don't want to think that I know everything, right? So I have people close to me who like inform me and teach me a lot of things. The fifth thing I'd probably do is free the political prisoners that haven't been freed yet.
Yeah, I think that would be a good olive branch to the people who are more on the left, who are reluctant to support Castillo and obviously to support political prisoners, because it's a new era. And obviously the main enemy are always the capitalists, the imperialists, the Fujimoristas. The left should be united. And I hope if Castillo is elected, I hope he does do that. I hope he does free the prisoners. I think that would be great to see. And I think that it would reinvigorate. I mean, that's the thing. Like, if you look at Nepal, for example, there's unity between the Marxist-Leninists and the Maoists. After the election in Nepal, there was the United Communist Party of Nepal, and it united the Maoist faction, the Marxist-Leninist faction that had been wearing and beefing for many years, and they were able to unite those two sides in a way that was very interesting. And I know in India, the Communist Party of India, Marxist, is also trying to reach out to the Naxalites as well in terms of building unity. Unfortunately, the Naxalites have been more reluctant to support them. They call them, collaborators and revisionists. But I think for Pedro Castillo to reach out to the ex-Shining Path or current Shining Path people to be like, look, let's integrate, let's work together, I think that would be a positive sign of unity. And I think any revolutionary would want to do that. I think Chavez did that, Ortega did that in Nicaragua, Fidel did that in Cuba, and I think that would be something that would be beautiful to see.
It's a necessary alliance. It can also help increase the consciousness of some of the ones that, want to take extreme measures and kill innocent people, raise their consciousness and be like, hey, here's a more effective strategy, right? We want to bring people in to our movement and not scare them away by threatening them. That's why like education, like improving education is also really important, so that these people that are in such desperate situations have their conscious level raised enough to think about better strategies for their goal. And I just want to also mention before we end the stream that some of the disagreements that I have with Castillo obviously are some of his stances on social issues, but that's not a reason to cancel him. Like it's different in Peru and in other countries, right? They're not there yet in terms of like some of the people in the older generation haven't fully accepted these social issues, like how it's more moral and more to give like the LGBTQ community more rights, to give people the freedom of choice for abortion, like women the freedom of choice for abortion. But they'll get there. But economically and focusing on helping families, like that's more effective. Like this is like a more like a socialism del campo, right?
Yeah. I think that's the right approach, Franco. I mean, that's the revolutionary and socialist way of understanding reality and understanding what we call ontology or reality in life. Is in order to have a social revolution, you first need an economic revolution. And that's part of the Marxist theory of historical materialism. First, there's an economic revolution, a change in the means of production, a change in society, more money for schools, more money for education, to teach people about LGBTQ rights, to teach people about women's rights, to teach people about other struggles that people are unaware of. Once you have that economic base, that economic revolution, then there's a social revolution where people's minds begin to change. People become more open-minded. We saw that happen in the Soviet Union and China as well, where both feudal countries that had feudal economic systems. Once the means of production were raised, once people had the basic necessities, had a school to go to, a house to live in, then they could become more open-minded about different things. And from there, there's a political revolution as the last stage, where new laws are put into place to reflect those new social changes, those new social views, where you can legalize gay marriage, you can legalize all sorts of things. And so it's a process. Again, it's a dialectical process. It's not going to happen overnight. And that's something that it takes years to really understand. It took me a while to understand that too. And I think it's something that I'm glad you mentioned. But Comrade Franco, it's really been a pleasure talking to you, bro. I really appreciate your streams, your channel. For everybody who's watching and listening, by the way, shout out to Erica. I love Erica's work. Erica has been doing some really great streams. Shout out to Orlando. Y'all are mad funny in the chat, by the way. You guys have some really cool commentary, but I love y'all. Thanks for watching and listening. And Franco, please support Franco's channel, Frank Analysis. It is such a great channel. I watch it like almost every day whenever you have streams, because that's usually when I'm getting off of work and just chilling, and it feels like I'm having a conversation. So please subscribe to Frank Analysis. And compañero, it's been really dope talking to you, man. I hope all is well, and peace out. Take care.
Thank you, brother.
Peace.
Peace.